Hey viewers, welcome to the brand new episode of Sales Gambit. I'm your host Ashish, CEO of Convin, a conversation intelligence platform for the sales. We have mostly spoken about startup sales on Sales Gambit, but we are going to pull it a notch higher in this, and we'll be talking about the ins and outs of enterprise sales in B2B industry. And for that, I have a very special guest. She has over 15 years of experience in sales and is the fractional VP of sales at Digital Reach Online Solutions. And she's also founder of Sales Team Builder and much more. Welcome to Sales Gambit, Leslie. We're so excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Ashish. Excited for this conversation.
Really looking forward, Leslie. So I have given a brief intro, but we would love to know from you, how did your sales journey begin? Was it a smooth ride? Probably if you can tell us about how did you get into sales and then, where you are currently working at.
I think it's been the opposite of a smooth ride. I didn't intend to pursue a career in sales. I'd gone to university for marketing, and like so many young people, I thought I would actually use my college degree. So I was going to do like an event marketing or coordinating or something in marketing. Those jobs, I realized, weren't going to pay the amount that I needed to be able to afford to live in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So I'd moved to Chicago without a job. I'd like sold all of my belongings, showed up there with 2 suitcases and, desire to be successful and to make it. And so I found a sales job. It was a $18K base living in Chicago, but it had the potential for commission. And there was something really attractive to me. And I think that's true for a lot of folks in sales. There was something really attractive to me about the opportunity to earn more if I worked harder. Mm-hmm. Or work smarter, whatever the case may be, but to be in control of my earnings. And that's certainly been a motivating factor to me throughout my career. And, I think she's so many of the things that come really naturally to me, like curiosity and a desire to help people, and, a knack for rhetoric and asking questions, translated really well to success in that first sales role. And here I am 15 years later, still loving the profession despite, some rocky road moments.
Very interesting. I mean, this is one of the best possible jobs, isn't it? I mean,
it really is.
You control of your life. You want to work hard, you go and work hard, and then, you get the benefits as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I think sales is a hard job. I mean, people often will say I try to be really transparent about pay and sort of what I've made along the way and what I make now. And, particularly 15 years later, and, I make an impressive amount of money. And so many folks are like, oh, I want to do sales then. Like, wait, you can just get 6 figures in sales. And it's yes, you can. It is a really lucrative job. There are a lot of opportunities to earn. But as you know, it's also a very tough job. It is hard to constantly face rejection. It is hard to constantly have to put yourself in the right, sort of like mental space. So it's not for everybody, but for those of us who love it, I mean, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine doing anything else.
No, that's totally true. That's totally, once you start getting the hang of it and you start, closing those deals, you can't go back actually.
Yeah.
I'm totally on board with that. So let's start with the basics, right? Our audience is heavily informed about sales because they are themselves the sales people, and assuming they already are aware of SMB sales and enterprise sales. But to get this conversation started, Leslie, from the first principles, I would love to understand, in your experience, a couple of major differences from an SMB sales and an enterprise sales perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so last year, I had the opportunity through Sales Team Builder, which is my company that primarily serves like seed to Series A, like founder-led company or companies that have founder-led sales models still. And so especially over the last year, I've had an opportunity to understand how different that SMB startup model is from the type of enterprise sales I'm doing, I would say one of the biggest differences is that it is significantly harder to get access to folks at the enterprise level. They are just getting a much higher volume of outreach, whether that's via LinkedIn or emails or cold calls. So the first difference is that the kind of threshold for quality of outreach has to be much, much, much higher. Like you can't be doing an okay job and still earn the right to the inboxes and the calendars at the enterprise level. And I would say another significant difference is the number of stakeholders involved at enterprise decision making. When you think about SMB, it's maybe just the founder, it's a couple founders, or maybe a small executive team. So I found at that level, I'm often dealing with a decision maker, or at most like 2 or 3. Whereas at the enterprise level, I'm consistently dealing with 7, 8, 9, 10 decision makers. So those are 2 really clear distinctions that I can call out straight away.
Very interesting. So one, if I understand what you mentioned, is how do you get access to right people, considering the amount of volume they would be getting from multiple other people, right? And you have to stand out in that, right? I have 2 questions that I want to ask related to that first difference that you just mentioned, right? One, what is the best channel to then get access to these prospects in enterprise sales companies, right?
Yep.
I mean, we have heard about multiple channels like networking events, conferences. It can be a personal introduction that someone can do for you and all of that. But in your experience, what has worked really well for you over the period in time to get access to these people?
Yeah, so the best channel is definitely a multi-channel approach.
Okay.
You absolutely have to be reaching out to them on LinkedIn, via email, and with phone calls to have success. Something that's really interesting is that when we look at executives, those VPs and C-suite titles at the enterprise level, the majority of them still prefer a direct phone call as the first touch point in cold outreach.
Okay.
And, I think if we sort of look at what's happening on the LinkedIn newsfeed, or at least my LinkedIn newsfeed, it's so many people saying cold calling is dead. It's, social selling only. Nobody wants a phone call, and that's at the enterprise level unequivocally false. So I think the first piece is that you need to build out your sequences or your cadences, that pattern of outreach, in a way that does incorporate LinkedIn touch points, maybe other social touch points, phone calls, and emails. So that's hugely important. Something else that you mentioned, Ashish, were those opportunities for referrals. I, as you know, on LinkedIn, on TikTok, I'm a big advocate of creating my own content, sharing my own content to build a brand, and then also really prioritizing engagement. At the enterprise level, I've found that serves me extremely well because it builds some brand recognition, some credibility, some trust.
Okay.
From so, when we talk about setting ourselves apart, we know that the majority of buyers will go check out your company website or your personal LinkedIn prior to accepting a call with you, or prior to getting on a call with you. So I think that combination of having your own online presence and building out a thoughtful multi-channel approach is like the foundation that everybody has to be doing to succeed in enterprise sales.
Very interesting. So you mean to say that a couple of things, including multi-channel approach, and then creating yourself, or basically making sure that you are coming out as compared to everyone else, right? Differentiating yourself is going to be important. How about these traditional channels of conferencing, networking events? Do you think salespeople can get a break in enterprise sales around these channels? Go to the prospects.
I do. I really, really do. It's actually a sort of one of the spaces that I serve through Sales Team Builder, because I spent almost a decade in the event space, in the executive event space. So I've seen the power of both virtual and live events. I think humans crave connection. And when we have that opportunity to get to know somebody on a more personal level, those business conversations can happen a bit more organically. They seem a bit more genuine. So 100%, I think there's a tremendous amount of power in events. But I will tell you, most people do it wrong. And what I mean by that is most people take a very generic approach to how they're going to interact with folks at events. And that could look like maybe you see everybody else that signed up for the event and you just send the same generic email to everybody. Or I think what we've all probably seen in this virtual world is that you attend a webinar, a virtual event, and then 3 days later, you get a generic email from one of the sponsors that's like, thank you for attending this event. I was a sponsor at the event. Here's a white paper that may or may not be pertinent to you. Instead, because the power of events is the connection, you need to carry that connectivity after the event and say something like, I saw that you were at the event after looking at your profile or your company press releases or your CEO statements, whatever that piece of content is. It seems like X is really important to you. I'd love to learn more about why that's important. I'd love to learn more about this. So you need to lead with that curiosity and that relevant but still personalized approach versus the generic follow-up to make those event connections really stick.
That's a very interesting piece of advice. I would love to understand a bit more about the second difference that you really pointed out, which was around involvement of multiple stakeholders in SMB as compared to an enterprise, right? How different it is, right? How difficult does it make an enterprise deal in general? If you can give us some understanding, some examples, and how should salespeople really come across around this whole thing of multiple stakeholders?
I found that it makes it much more difficult. And there's the obvious reason of trying to get, 7, 8 people on the same page. But I think what sits below that is that often sales reps fail to understand that people buy for emotional reasons. And later they justify those purchases with logic. But it's emotion that is driving the initial need, the desire to buy. And when you think about selling to multiple personas at the enterprise level, each of them has their own emotional attachment to why they want to buy, or I think more importantly, what the desired outcome is. So trying to get, let's say 8 people with 8 different desired outcomes and 8 different forms of emotional attachment to what they want your product or service to do to them, to agree on one reason to buy, that's really challenging. And the result of that is that really often at the enterprise level, the end action is just no action. So people get sort of stuck in like a decision paralysis because there's so many competing needs and wants and expectations of the outcome. So my number one tip for people would be take the time to understand who the ultimate decision maker is, like who's ultimately going to give you that yes or no, who the influencers are on that decision. Understand that one thing that is most important for all of the influencers, and then try to build a consensus on the thread or the thing that the majority of them want. But always make sure that you deeply understand what the decision-making criteria is for that final person that's going to give you the yes, no, and let that be your sort of driving force, or your kind of North Star for your conversations with influencers.
And that actually is correct, right? I mean, if, for example, if you don't know or don't understand who's your decision maker and why are they going to make a certain decision, whether it is a yes or a no, it's extremely hard for you to be able to communicate that properly during this course of conversation and then ultimately lead to that result. But the question that I would want to ask you is, it's easier said than done, right? It would be extremely difficult to, one, identify the buyer and who will actually make that decision, and then probably a couple of influencers or the champions involved in the deal, right? And then second, what do they really want, right? How do you suggest someone who's in sales, and let's say they have started selling to enterprise sales, try to go around these and help themselves with answering these two questions?
Absolutely. So one book that I would recommend that's exceptional for folks that are new to enterprise selling is The Challenger Customer. So not The Challenger Sale, which is the one that everybody knows about, but the second book, which is called The Challenger Customer, because it dives deep into personas. And what I think enterprise sellers will find really helpful is understanding when influencers are just the talkers. They talk a big game, they seem helpful, but they're not going to be able to drive change. The folks that are actually gatekeepers and they're resistant to change, that you kind of want to go around. The folks that might be cynics, and your first reaction may be to not want to engage with them because they seem cynical, they seem skeptical, but really that's a great person to engage with, because if you get their buy-in, they're going to go fight for you. So my first recommendation is go read The Challenger Customer and really use that to get a deeper understanding of who your advocates are going to be and who you just kind of don't want to waste time with. The second thing that I've found extremely helpful and anybody can do today is a process called multi-threading. And for folks that haven't heard of multi-threading before, it is as simple as going through, if you have Sales Nav, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, it's especially simple, but even if you don't, it's the process of identifying anybody in the organization that you think could be an influencer. And while your cold outreach really needs to stay focused on the ultimate decision maker, that's the person you want to set that introductory, that discovery meeting with. You can also be engaging with content that the influencers are posting. You can put the influencers maybe into a nurture campaign where you aren't asking them for a meeting, but you're sharing a valuable blog post, a relevant invite to a webinar. So you are nurturing them to build that brand recognition and build a little bit of credibility. And the hope is, if it goes well, that when you finally meet with that ultimate decision maker and they go back to their team to say, hey, has anybody heard of Convin? Has anybody heard of Sales Team Builder? They say, oh, yeah, I actually think I got a white paper from Convin last week and it was really helpful. Yeah, it was interesting. And so you've earned a little bit of that right then to the time and the respect of the decision maker, because you've laid some of those foundations. So those are two really easy to action tips. Re-challenge your customer, start multi-threading immediately.
Very interesting. And how do you get to know their intentions? What are the things that they are basing their entire conversation on the deal for? On what things they will take a decision? How do you reach to that point or that level of information?
Yeah. So interestingly, I think that piece is a bit easier at the enterprise level than it is at like the startup SMB mid-market level, because almost all of these enterprises are publicly traded. They've all IPO'd, right? That's why they're multi-billion-dollar organizations, which means you have access to their 10Ks. You have access to their, almost all of them will have like a press release or a news section on their website. You have access to the recordings of their investor calls. One of my go-tos is to look up the statements that the CEO made for the year. You can find them 99% of the time. The trick is CEOs always want growth. So even if you can't find it, it's probably going to be something growth related. But, if you think about the enterprise sale, those folks have to serve their CEO's vision because that's what's been promised to the customers and to the stakeholders.
Yeah.
So take that CEO statement and use your understanding of that particular business unit vertical product to figure
Mhm.
out what piece of the CEO's goals are going to trickle down to them. But
Mhm.
it can be as simple as saying, Ashish, I saw that your CEO is dedicated to driving growth by being more sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd love to hear how your sales and marketing team is incorporating that into conversations with buyers. And you're starting that conversation from a place of knowledge and understanding of something that's important to their business, and also
Mhm.
curiosity about what it means for your specific buyer.
That's fairly interesting, right? And I would add one question here only because you have mentioned CEOs and everyone, right? How do you suggest someone should go about enterprise sales? Should they go bottoms up or tops down?
Top down,
And
always
what
top
is the reason? What is
down.
the reason for that?
A couple of reasons. One is that enterprises are very hierarchical, right?
Yeah.
Like it's very rare that when you're in an organization that's big, that they're making sort of decisions as a team democratically. Like there is a boss, and the boss is the person that makes the decision. There's also probably a lot more processes or red tape involved.
Mhm.
Um, and the way that I think about it, that I would encourage other folks to think about it, is we are the salespeople. Like it is our responsibility to sell. We are the individuals with the deep product knowledge and the ability to serve the customer in a way that is most valuable to them, is the best use of their time. If you start bottom up, you are then asking somebody else to take on a piece of your responsibility, to do that selling for you. That's not their job. That's your job, the salesperson's job. And it's a bit of an unrealistic expectation because they didn't do onboarding with your company. They don't have the deep product knowledge. So
Yeah.
you're kind of setting somebody up for failure if you're doing only bottom up selling. I think there's a way to sandwich that where you are talking to the decision maker, and at the same time you are going through the process of getting the influencers bought in, of better understanding their needs. But if you're only doing bottom up because those people are easier to reach, and then your expectation is that they will get you in the door with the decision maker, they'll sell for you, your win rates are just going to be so much lower.
Interesting, interesting. And when you talk about, let's say, we reaching out to high level people, or let's say CXO or C executives, right, in a company for tops down approach, what are a couple of things that you have seen people doing wrong while they are trying to sell to these C executives or C level executives?
So I would say one thing that's really obvious is totally generic outreach,
Okay.
where they put 100 CFOs into an
Yeah.
outreach cadence, and every single one of them gets the same generic set of messages. The second, sort of, once people leave behind the generic outreach, I often find that the first thing they'll do is try to go with personalized outreach and get it wrong. And what I mean by getting personalized outreach wrong is that they'll send an email that's like, "Oh, I saw you went to college. I also went to college. Go college. Anyways, my product is."
Yeah.
And it's just so inauthentic, and it's so obvious that this person wanted to check the box of personalization without
Right.
actually taking the time to make it really relevant and really valuable. So what I
Right.
always say is that relevance trumps personalization. If you're able to figure out how to combine them,
Mhm.
great. And then I would say the third thing that I see people doing wrong are really long emails. They try to pack everything that they want to say to this person into one email. And emails in general for cold outreach should be really short, like 4 to 5 sentences. But when you're thinking about C-suite, people that are getting 400 to 1,000 emails a day,
Yeah.
if you are not sticking to those like 1 to 2 word subject lines, emails optimized to be read on mobiles, no more than 4 or 5 sentences, you're kind of sabotaging yourself, because a CFO of a Fortune 500 company is just never going to read your 20-sentence email.
That's totally right, right? In fact, no, I can't even imagine a CFO spending so much time to look into these emails and then put up a reply for that. Totally on point. One other thing that I wanted to understand, because we are now talking about enterprise sales and how do you continue that? I've seen personally a lot of people dropping the ball in between, right? We started the conversation with the context that you set up is that this is a very hard job, right? And obviously enterprise sales is even harder, right? And a lot of people tend to drop the ball after one or two or a couple of tries, or probably 5 tries, about a month or so in the picture. What has been your personal experience around this? When should someone say that, hey, I've tried enough and now it's my time to move on?
Exceptional question. Yeah, that's a hard one, right? Because you don't want to give up too early, but you don't also want to overdo it and burn the contact. Yeah, really great question. So the minimum that you want to do is 8 touch points. That's like the minimum I'll ever build into any sequence. Most of the sequences, the cadences, which is just a fancy word for saying the pattern of outreach I'm doing, most of mine are 12 to 20 touch points.
Okay.
I, at the enterprise level, start my outreach with more of a nurture mentality. So I'm really showing up to deliver value and make deposits and ask for nothing in return at the beginning of my sequences. And again, the hope is, I'm earning the right to their inbox. I'm earning the right to their calendar by taking the time to personalize in a relevant way and to deliver value to that executive, so that when I ask for the meeting, when I ask for time in their calendar, I've shown that I'm putting in the work, that I deserve it to some extent, and that I have something to offer them. So minimum 8. I encourage you to do more than 8. And when you think about what good looks like, lead with value instead of asks. Like, do not ever start a cadence by being like, the first email you've ever sent is, let's meet on Tuesday at 10 or 2, right? Like, you've simply not earned the right to their inbox or calendar at that point. And then, I think at like 20, if we're going to put it like a nice even number on it, if you've done a 20 touch point cadence, and this is a combination of social, of, maybe having somebody else that they know email, doing your own emails, doing your own phone calls, then you want to put a contact on ice for a little bit, and give them at least a 3-month break, or put them back into a nurture cadence that's strictly nurture, where you're only doing those gives, making those valuable deposits without asking for anything in return.
I have an added question here, right? You said 15, you have 10 to 12 touch points, and it can continue even to 20 touch points. What is the period of these touch points? Over what period these are spanned?
So if I'm thinking about totally cold outreach, I do not know this person, they didn't attend a webinar, they aren't an MQL, totally cold outreach. I have actually had a lot more success at the enterprise level with longer sequences, which is, if you look at like what Sales Loft or somebody like that suggests, that is not their best practice. They do like really tight, rapid touch point sequences. Like they'll do 12 to 15 in 20 days. Like they're hitting it hard. I've had a lot of success with more stretched out sequences because I start with that nurture. And I want to remember that these people are really busy. So if I send them an email, even if it is valuable, they might not open it for 2 or 3 days. And then they want, I want to give them a chance to actually read it before I have another email in their inbox. So I tend to stretch those ones out a bit more. If it's inbound or an MQL, I do make those a bit tighter because I'm working on the assumption that they know the brand name and there might be some interest, and I want them to meet with me now instead of later, where there might be some If we think about the emotional buying peak, where there might be a chance that they're higher in the emotional buying peak.
So can I say that this is somewhere close to 1.5 months for you, for the span of time?
For like MQL outreach, yeah, I would say like 4 to 6 weeks.
4 to 6.
Yeah, 4 to 6 weeks for totally cold leads.
Yeah.
I have some cadences that are 6 months.
Very interesting. That's extremely interesting. So it's basically then nurturing them, making sure that they are aware about the product, then they move into that consideration phase and the decision making process later on. If I have to ask you one more related question, because I really want to understand this a lot better for us and our audiences. Let's say you reached out to the right prospect who you were supposed to reach out into the enterprise sales scenario, and you obviously reached out to them over a period of 1.5 months, and you identified initially 2 or 3 prospects that you think are the right people to reach out to. None of them replied, right? There was no response. Do you drop the ball there, or do you say that, hey, what I'll do is I'll revisit after a month, and then probably I'll add 3 more people from different departments which are not directly related, but if even one of them can get me an intro to someone like that would be beneficial. So do you keep that approach in general?
So not quite. If I have put somebody through, let's say that full cadence, like you said, like there are 3 people, I'm sure they're extremely qualified. I know I have the right person, but none of them reply. So I'm going to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to go back through my emails to see which emails were even opened. And if none of my emails were opened, then I want to look at those emails to see if there's like spam words in them that might be hitting spam filters. Maybe there's deliverability issues. I mean, first and foremost, I would never run a campaign with 3 people. I would at least try to put 10 people into it a day, do some A/B testing. So hopefully we would never get to the point where we've gone through a whole cadence and nobody that we added to it replied.
10 people from the same company is what you mean, right?
No. 10 decision makers. I would never put 10 people. A couple things. I would never put 10 people from the same company in an outreach cadence, because I don't want to meet with 10 people from the same company. I want to meet with the decision maker. So when I think about cold outreach cadences, there's going to be one set of outreach that goes to the decision maker, the person that I want the meeting with.
Correct.
And then if I'm running influencer campaigns, those are fully automated, just there for value drops. That's not something I'm spending a bunch of time on, because we only have our 40 hours in the week. And I don't want to spend that time chasing people that can only say no, but never have the ability to actually like write that check and say yes. So it's the way I kind of think about it, Ashish, is bridging the gap between demand gen and lead gen. So if I'm running nurture campaigns for influencers and one of them raises their hand and says, yes, I would like to learn more, I'm going to obviously meet with that person.
Got it.
That's not who I'm going to be targeting to fill up my day with. I really want to make sure that I'm staying focused on that ultimate decision maker. But to answer your question, let's say it was 50 decision makers that we put through, a cadence, and at the end of it, we didn't get any meetings. So I'm going to really go back through first, and I'm going to look at the copy, see what the open rates were, see if there were like at least negative reply rates at some point where we got people. So I'm gonna diagnose the copy, but like, let's assume in that situation that the copy was great. Like we had really good open rates, we had really good reply rates, which means that we probably were either reaching out to people with the wrong type of content. Like we didn't do enough research to ensure that it was relevant and it was valuable, or we're just reaching out to them at the wrong time. Correct. Which when you get to the enterprise level, very few of them have rolling budget cycles like you do see at SMB, where they can just kind of pull budget out here and there. They do have much more processed budget cycles. So it might just be that we contacted them in March and it was really interesting and valuable, but they don't start budget conversations until September.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, I might put them in a similar type of nurture campaign that I would have influencers in, where I'm just trying to stay top of mind. I'm making those valuable deposits so that when the timing is right, it's that same concept of I've now earned the right to their calendar. I've now earned the right to their consideration because I've spent X amount of months building my credibility and being a valuable partner to them instead of just constantly coming into their inbox to ask them to meet with me again when the timing or the topic might not be right.
Makes sense.
Does that kind of flesh it out a bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I am totally, I think, in agreement with what you're saying. But would you again reach out to them after a month or so by, let's say, improving your copies or something like that? Would you go back again to them? And what time frame would you look for before you go back again to them?
I would either put them into a nurture cadence immediately, where I'm moving them out of a sales cadence and into more of a marketing cadence, or if I wanted to only keep them in a sales cadence, I would probably put them on ice and not reach out for 3 months. Like I would give them a good long break before I reached out again.
Interesting. A related question would be that then should company divide their teams in a way where they say that, okay, these people will reach out to SMBs, these people will reach out to enterprises only, so that they can have a focused approach? Or do you think even the mixing is fine of the teams?
I think it depends on the product, the level of revenue they're at. Like, are they billing enough MRR where it makes sense to have a segmented team? I think what you see most often is that SMB is a full cycle rep, because you just don't need a full dedicated like BDR, SDR team at the SMB level. Those people are still learning a lot of the sales process. And so having them work the full cycle is a great learning opportunity to own that contact all the way through. At the enterprise level, primarily because the sales tend to be much more complicated, like longer sales cycles, more involved sales cycles. Companies do usually need their enterprise AEs to be wholly focused on just the selling process. Some of that too is that enterprise AEs like simply cost more money. So when you look at resourcing an FTE, like, are you going to pay somebody a 150K base to do the job of an SDR when you can pay an SDR 50K? So I mean, some of it's just like brass tacks of financials. But when we think about elite enterprise SDRs, they are very thoughtful and very strategic in the way they have conversations and the way that they are creating proposals and walking folks through the sales process. So that often requires them to be totally focused on the selling versus the generating of the lead. So it's going to be different for every organization, but what I found in general works best is that at the enterprise level, do a split between the lead gen and the selling, and at SMB, run it as a full cycle.
Makes sense. Now something that we want to switch over, and I've been meaning to ask this question since we started this call, but a lot of founders are building in India, right? And you'd already be aware that India is riding that wave of B2B SaaS companies and building a lot of products out here, right? And for us, a larger target market generally is US, because that's where people are open to try out the products and see if they can help them or not. 2 questions very specifically for founders of India, right? Building for US. How do they get to understand US as a market, right? What should they be doing to understand US as a market? Obviously in their own industries, right? Second, how do they go about selling to those industries once they have figured out something? How should the approach initially be? Because someone building in India would not have equal trust and credibility there in US, right? Immediately. That's understood, right? How should they go about those 2 things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And you're totally right. I'm seeing so many more like SaaS companies coming out of India, so many more partnerships. So that's a really exciting kind of evolution and development. I even use quite a few freelancers that are based in India. So one thing that I found, and this isn't just like India to North America, but with the exception of the 2 years I was running the startup, I've spent my entire professional career working for English companies. And in my last 2 head of sales jobs, I was hired to help them translate what worked in EMEA to the Americas market. So it's not just India founders that struggle with this. Like, even without a potential language barrier and with a tremendous amount of cultural similarities, it's something that a lot of people fail to get right. And here's the number one thing I can point to, Ashish, is that too often there's an assumption that there's just America and you just need to figure out how to sell to America. And why that doesn't work is that America is extraordinarily regionalized.
Okay.
So the way that you communicate with folks based in New York versus Alabama versus California, very different personalities, very different styles of outreach are going to work for them. Different types of messaging is going to work for them. What you will find is that industries do tend to be very focused within regions as well. So like the Midwest is really known for automotive. The West Coast is really known for tech. The East Coast is really known for financial services. So some of it is, who is your ICP? Who is your ideal customer profile? And if you're selling to a specific industry, where is that industry based? And I think a lot of it is that folks assume America's America, and they really need to dig a bit deeper to not just understand the American personality, but the personality of the specific regions that they are selling to.
Can you give me a specific example? You said that different messages, different outreaches, different thing would work because everything is regionalized, right? Can you give me a specific example of, let's say, a messaging that would work in New York but not work in Alabama or somewhere else for that matter?
I think in general, a lot of the messaging that doesn't translate well is that Americans overall are much more direct.
Okay.
And I know for my English colleagues, it makes them extremely uncomfortable to not start an email by saying, I trust you're well, or I hope this email finds you well. And Americans just find that gross for the most part. And clearly I'm talking in generalities. Not every English person does that. Not every American feels that way. But they tend to be overly polite for the American appetite, who prefers a more direct form of communication. I think you see a lot of that in answering questions too. And this just isn't English. I've served teams in APAC, teams in Latin America, and they won't answer a question just with a straight shot back. They'll kind of go around the question and try to paint a bigger picture. But often, if you are the CFO of a company and you say, "What's the price?" You expect somebody to just come back to you and say, "Oh, it's 50 to 100K depending on what your needs are." Not, "Well, I just need to get to know more about you and we can do." So I think those differences are a little bit easier to point out because they are very distinct cultural differences. I think that's easier for people to get right. What is much more difficult for people to get right is to understand what's going to be different about how you talk to somebody in New York versus Alabama.
Interesting.
Because the way that you talk to somebody in New York is going to generally be very direct, very to the point, very fast. They just speak much more quickly, and it's a lot more formal. The conversation is a lot more formal, whereas the way that you're going to communicate with somebody in Alabama, They're going to talk slower generally. The conversation's going to be a little bit more formal. They're more of a like, my word is my bond, we'll do a deal on a handshake sort of people.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. That was kind of a rabbit hole of an explanation, but I would say the biggest thing that I see people get wrong isn't understanding the general differences between what works in their country and what works in America. It's understanding the nuances of not just what generally works in America, but digging a bit deeper to understand what works in the specific regions or specific industries that they're selling to, because they're going to have their own personalities.
I'm really happy. I can't even explain how breeze these 40 minutes were. I mean, I was just engrossed in talking to you, and it felt like a coaching session to me, at least. I'm pretty much sure this is going to be extremely valuable to our audiences as well.
I'm so happy to hear that. And some of it's so easy, like the multi-threading is just, it's something that's often gate capped by like the top enterprise AEs. And so if you're not in that bubble, you don't realize it's happening, but it's such an easy technique that anybody can use and apply it even outside of enterprise sales. So hopefully some of those concepts around like, short emails, make sure they're mobile optimized, earn the right to your prospects, inbox, earn the right to their calendar, multi-thread for credibility. Those work across all sales environments. But if you're not doing them at the enterprise level, you're not going to be successful. So hopefully, some of those are pieces that your listeners can take and use today.
Definitely, Leslie. Those were all the questions, Leslie, that I had for you today. Really happy and thankful that you joined the podcast and helped us. I'd love to meet you again and then probably have another podcast on different topics.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Ashish. This was my pleasure.
Thank you for coming here, Leslie. This is Ashish signing off from Sales Gambit. We will present you a new podcast next week. Have a happy day.